Welcome to Minty's EDH Sleepers, Episode 2. This is a series where I talk about my favorite underplayed or underrated cards for Commander, and I give my take on why these cards need to see more play. Keep in mind that these aren't necessarily budget cards, but more cards that I rarely see in a game of Commander. I'll put the price of each card up on the screen and also go over the number of decks that they appear in according to EDH Rec. Let's go ahead and get started with number 1. First up, we've got Wayfarer's Oh, wait, what? Someone else already uses that? Oh, okay. Alright, well, moving on. First on my list is a white card called Rebuff the Wicked. Currently only sees play in 2% of decks on EDH Rec. That's only 6,000 decks out of a possible 385,000 decks. It's only 1 white mana for an instant that says counter target spell that targets a permanent you control. Think about how many times you have a permanent out on the battlefield that you really need to stick around in order to win you the game. You know, maybe you're playing a Voltron Commander deck like Rafik the Mini, or you have an Aetherflux Reservoir that you have on board and you need to storm out and win. If someone tries to, sword your commander or use a Nature's Claim to get rid of your Aetherflux, 1 white mana and you've countered it. Personally, I run this in my Tristani Selesnya's voice deck because I don't have access to blue, and pretty much all of my win cons are permanents. I've got Aetherflux Reservoir, Phyrexian Processor, Helm of the Host, things like that. And I think being able to protect my win cons for 1 white mana is a pretty good deal. I think this card really shines in any deck that doesn't have access to blue. Currently, it's only $2 thanks to the Time Spot Remastered reprint, so I think it's worth picking up. Second on the list is a blue card called Precognition Field. It's only in 1% of decks, and it's currently 29 cents on TCG Player. It's 3 generic and a blue for an enchantment that reads, you may look at the top card of your library, you may cast the top card of your library if it's an instant or sorcery card, and it has an activated ability for 3 that says exile the top card of your library. Part of the reason I like this card so much is that others don't get to know what's on top of your library. You're not playing with the top card of your library revealed, you're just allowed to look at the top card of your library whenever you want. Also, it has a built-in way to manipulate the top card of your library without being $60. Looking at you, Top. I think this card gets overlooked because there are a lot of really good 4 mana value cards out there already, but in a Spellslinger type deck, this card is just amazing. It means you could potentially have access to another counter spell or another card draw spell on top of your library. Because of that, I would consider this to be card advantage. It gives you access to an extra card that you normally wouldn't have. Even if your hand is empty, you kind of have 1 card in your hand if you think about it. Also, if you have infinite mana, this basically just becomes exile cards from the top of your library until you get the card you need to win, So you can just keep exiling top card of your library until you hit that expropriate or the extra turn spells, whatever it is that you need to win. I will admit that I don't think it's the best 4 mana enchantment out there, but I think in the right deck, this card can be extremely good. Third on my list is Soul Exchange. This card is currently in 0% of decks on EDH Rec. I don't know how. It's a black for a sorcery that reads, and I'm going to use the Oracle text here, as an additional cost to cast this spell, exile a creature you control, return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield, put a +2/+2 counter on that creature if the exiled creature was a Thrall. First off, what the heck is a 2/2 counter? That's not 2 1/1 counters. No, this is a single counter that gives your creature +2/+2. So if you have this card in any type of proliferate deck and you proliferate this counter, you get another +2/+2 counter on your creature. I've also seen a lot more decks with Tevish Satz as a partner commander, and he pumps out Thralls with his +2 ability, making Soul Exchange a very powerful card in that deck. I know it's sorcery speed, and I know there are better cards out there like Reanimate, Animate Dead, things like that. But for 40 cents, it's a really good pickup. You can never really have too much creature recursion, right? Coming up next, we have a red card named Shiny Impetus. This card was over 5% on EDH Rec a while back, probably because it was in the Prosper Precon deck, but it now sits at 2%. I'm probably the only person who didn't take this out of my Prosper deck, but that's because I think it's honestly really good. It's an enchantment aura that costs 2 and a red and reads, enchanted creature gets +2/+2 and is goaded. Whenever enchanted creature attacks, you create a treasure token. Goaded just means that the creature has to attack next turn, and they can't attack you or a planeswalker you control. So in most cases, you're going to put this on your opponent's biggest, scariest creature to prevent them from attacking you. Just think about if your opponent has like a Blightsteel Colossus or a Voltron Commander that can one-shot you. Now it has to attack someone else, and you don't have to worry about it for a few more turns. And to top it off, you get a free treasure token. It can also be used on a creature that your opponent doesn't want attacking. Say they have an Elvish Piper or a Seedborn Muse out. Now the other players can block and kill those creatures that would otherwise not attack. It's also one of those cards that kind of just goes under the radar because it isn't game breaking in any way, but it's usually going to net you 3 or 4 treasures, and it's going to hurt your opponents in the process. So might as well let your opponents do all the work for you, right? Fifth on the list is a green card that sees a lot of play according to EDH Rec, but I feel like I never see this card played. Like it's never on the other side of the table for me. That card is Harrow. It's an instant for 2 and a green that says, as an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice a land. Search your library for up to 2 basic land cards, put them onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library. There are a few reasons why I think this card is so good. First off, it's instant speed ramp. Most of the common ramp cards that you're going to be playing are sorceries. You've got those Ramping Growth, the Kodama's Reach, even 3 Visits. They're all sorcery speed, so they're a little bit slower. Another reason I think this card is so good, and this kind of ties into the first reason, is that those 2 lands come into play untapped. So you can play this in response to someone else's spell. Let's say you have a counter spell in hand and you want to counter the spell that your opponent just played. Well, you can go fetch up 2 islands, put them into play, counter that spell. Or, if they're targeting your stuff and you don't want them to do that, you can search for a forest and something else and cast your Heroic Intervention. The final reason I like this card so much is that it's great for any deck that cares about lands being in the graveyard. The first one that comes to mind is always Gitrog Monster, because you draw whenever a land hits the graveyard. But it's also amazing in those Delirium decks. Personally, I run this in my Ishkana Graph Widow Spider Tribal deck. But honestly, it's good in any green deck. And this card is under 40 cents on TCG Player. I don't see why you shouldn't pick this card up. Moving on to number 6, we have a colorless artifact called Credit Voucher. I absolutely love this card, and it's only in 635 decks out of 863,000 decks on EDH Rec. Pay 2 and tap, sacrifice Credit Voucher, shuffle any number of cards from your hand into your library, then draw that many cards. I don't know why this card sees a little play. I mean, it can literally go into any deck, and it allows you to wheel your entire hand or just the cards that you don't want, and then draw new cards. To make things better, artifacts are some of the easiest things to bring back from your graveyard. My Brea deck has like 5 or 6 different ways to bring back artifacts, including cards like Mirror Retriever, Sharun the Hegemon, things like that. I think Credit Voucher is amazing in any kind of deck where your winning is dependent on drawing cards. Think about how many times a Niv Mizzet player has 20, 30 cards in their hand. Well, now they can shuffle all those cards back into their library, draw 30 more cards, and deal out 30 more damage. It also goes great in a Locust God deck where you're always drawing cards, pumping out 1/1 hasty flyers. Definitely worth picking up, especially since it's under $1. Next up is a multicolored card called Perplex. This card costs 1 generic, a blue, and a black, and says counter target spell unless its controller discards their hand, and it also has Transmute for 1 blue black. First part is pretty good on its own because most people aren't going to discard their hand unless they know that the spell they're casting is going to win them the game, in which case you probably already lost anyway. But I think the better part of this card is its Transmute ability, which in my opinion is a very underrated mechanic. Transmute says discard this card, search your library for a card with the same mana value as the discarded card, reveal that card, put it in your hand, then shuffle your library. Activate it only as a sorcery. So Perplex is basically a counter spell or a tutor, depending on what you need at the time. And you're tutoring for a 3 mana card, so there are a lot of great options out there. If you're running this in, a Dimir Mill deck, this card is basically there to find you Bruvok, or if you're in a deck where you need infinite mana in order to win the game, this can go find you that Astronaut's Altar, Basalt Monolith, things like that. Maybe you're really just mana screwed and you need a Commander Sphere, who knows? All I know is I like cards that are basically 2 cards wrapped into one, and this fits that category. Last on my list is another land cycle. Yes, I love my lands. This time it is the Tainted Lands from Torment. There are 4 of them, and they are Tainted Fields, Tainted Isle, Tainted Peak, and Tainted Wood. Basically, they all tap for black and another color if you control a swamp. So yes, you need to be running black in order to use these lands, but when are you ever not going to have a swamp out when you're playing black, except for, maybe turn 1. And even in the worst case scenario, they still tap for colorless. It's not like it's just a dead land in your hand if you don't have a swamp out. The big thing I like about these, as I do with a lot of lands, is the fact that they don't come into play tapped, and they can tap for 2 colors. The only requirement for them tapping for 2 colors is having a swamp in play, and I think that's a pretty low requirement for essentially an untapped Guildgate. They weren't seeing much play until recently when they are reprinted in the Commander 2021 Midnight Hunt and Crimson Vow precon decks. I personally like the Torment versions the best. They just have this grit and kind of darkness about them that looks awesome in those old brown borders. They currently run between 20 cents and $3.50 depending on which one you pick up, and they see play in 7 to 11% of decks online. Well, that wraps up for this video, you guys. Let me know your favorite EDH Sleepers in the comments, and I'll be sure to give you a shout out if I use your card. Also, stay tuned for more EDH Sleepers in the near future. I got a whole list of them, and I just haven't been able to get around to it. So, appreciate you guys sticking around with me during this kind of video drought I've been in. Promise I'm going to have more content coming out soon, including a box of Modern Horizons 2, so you're not going to want to miss out. Thanks as always for the support, you guys, and remember, stay minty. I'll see you in the next one.